Hello, everyone. Welcome to Interoperability and TEFCA. My name is Tiffany Staples. I'm Vice President of Marketing here at Salient Healthcare, and I am joined by Sergio Wagner, our Chief Strategy Officer at Salient. Sergio will be talking about this topic today, and we actually had this webinar live just a little while ago. However, we had some audio issues, so we are re-recording this webinar so that it can come to you on demand. We're doing this in partnership with bbcexhibithall.com and their educational webinar series. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sergio. Take it away.
Thank you, Tiffany. So pretty excited to take two. So once again, my name is Sergio Wagner. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at Salient Health. And I promise, or I'll do my best not to PowerPoint you to death, but rather hopefully engage in a broad discussion that outlines the interoperability journey and the intersection with TEFCA. The aim, or our aim for this session, is to place these important topics at the forefront of your mind so that they will hopefully empower you to take some of this knowledge and key data points back to your respective organizations and use it as a catalyst to drive some crucial conversations forward. At a minimum, this webinar should hopefully be some exciting or some interesting learnings, but also a strong recommendation to actively participate and support all interoperability efforts and TEFCA. I will promise to pace my dialogue throughout the session, and I know now, based on experience, that we can actually do this in far under an hour. So that being said, interoperability and TEFCA. How did we get here? How do we got here? Where are we now? And what's next? Well, the journey to seamless healthcare integration has been long, complex, and marked by significant milestones in interoperability, and most notably, the implementation of the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, known as TEFCA. But let's talk about the impact of TEFCA. This is one of my favorite slides, and one of the reasons for that is because as a visual person, it very clearly outlines what the heck TEFCA stands for. It defines TEFs, that defines the technical exchange standards, and the CA defines the legal standards and/or data sharing. But the impact of TEFCA is interoperability ultimately aims to ensure that healthcare systems and applications can work together within and across organizational boundaries, while TEFCA provides the policies and the framework to achieve this goal of a national scale interoperability effort. The road here has involved overcoming some technical and regulatory as well as some practical challenges. But the integration of these efforts promises a future where healthcare data flows securely and efficiently, enhancing patient care and outcomes throughout the US. So let's talk about the evolution of interoperability in the US. Once again, I do apologize for how busy this slide is, but honestly, a lot has happened in the last 25 some odd years. Though it is very hard to see the image, I will acknowledge that I would argue that the journey really began in the year 1996 with the passage of HIPAA, the Health Insurance and Portability and Accountability Act, establishing standards for electronic health transactions and data privacy. I will highlight some of the meaningful, or what I determined to be some key milestones in the journey, such as in 2004, the Office of the National Coordination for Health Information and Technology, the ONC, was actually established to promote nationwide health and information and technology. From there, we leap forward to the year 2009 with the passage of the HITECH Act. And I think that from there would be safe to pass to 2016. And 2016 is when things really began cooking. By 2016, we have the 21st Century Cures Act is signed into law, mandating the development of interoperability standards and the prevention of information blockade. And in 2010, the ONC Cures Act rule is released, outlining specific requirements for healthcare providers, health IT developers, and health information networks to enhance data sharing and interoperability. From then, as the GM&R division says, we were arguably are cooking with gas. From 2021 to the present, there has been a tremendous effort in the movement of interoperability, along with continuing efforts to refine and reinforce interoperability standards across the ecosystem, specifically and most notably with the rollout of FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, and obviously TEFCA, which is the center stage of what we're talking about today, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, to ultimately facilitate this data sharing. This timeline reflects key milestones in the evolution of healthcare in the US, highlighting both the legislative actions and technological advancements. But what really puts this in perspective for me is the next slide, because when you think about the amount of work that was done over the last 25 plus years, which is incredible. I mean, we're talking about the creation and creation of agencies like the ONC, the signing of the Cures Act into law, and yet, in some ways, the last 36 months has almost dwarfed what happened in the 2 decades prior to that, because from the year 2021 to present, a lot has happened, and way too much to mention. So I'll denote some of the key highlights. In 2021, the initial release of TEFCA draft is done by the ONC. And same year, the development of the Common Agreement and Qualified Health Information Networks technical framework is rolled out. In 2022, final TEFCA draft is released. ONC begins onboarding and processing of potential QHIN applicants, and the first round of QHIN certifications is awarded. Also, the very first TEFCA-enabled exchange between two QHINs happens. And in 2023 and beyond, so much will continue to happen. But I think that when we look at the amount of work that has been done over the past 36 months, the single most important thing that any organization can think of is how to think about stakeholder engagement, maintaining the active engagement with healthcare providers, payers, patients, to ultimately gather feedbacks and address concerns, but supporting the existing framework that was already created and is live. Obviously, and along with regulatory support, working with federal and state regulatory bodies to ensure compliance and support of TEFCA. So that was about a mouthful. So where are we now? So hopefully the last set of slides told you a bit of an overview as to interoperability, the intersection with TEFCA, and what if TEFCA. So, but where are we now? Well, to really talk about where are we now, let's quickly address the foundation of what got us here, which are some quick wins and some persistent challenges that exist. So over the past decade, if not longer, there has been an incredible movement of massive undertaking by trailblazing organizations like the Angels of the Project, Care Quality, and Commonwealth. I have been fortunate enough to have known the past two executive directors of Commonwealth and Care Quality, as well as the current ones, in terms of the tremendous amount of work that they have done to move this interoperability effort forward. Not to mention that there hasn't been some hurdles. I want to touch on something that a colleague of mine and friend of mine actually said, Dave Gassel, former executive director, founding and former executive director of Care Quality and current chief commercial officer at Health Gorilla. He said, you can't do value-based care without data. And I wholeheartedly agree. Furthermore, I would go out and add that data needs to be transformed into actionable data and insights. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because while there has been a rush and a race in this sudden and availability of all of this data, one of the hurdles is the risks associated with oversight and governance. There has been a race by aggregators to provide access to data, which in turn can oftentimes create some hurdles around oversight, risk, and governance, and ensuring that we are sharing the right data for the right purpose always. That being said, we would be remiss not to mention the tremendous amount of work that these organizations have done to get us here, because they ultimately pave a lot of the way in which the current infrastructure for interoperability and data sharing exists today. So, but what does exist today? Well, let's talk about that. Well, let's see. I would be remiss not to mention that thanks to the ONC and the Sequoia project for putting this cool diagram, which we actually repurposed and adapted. But the reality is that if you really think about it, there are now more than 5. At the time, there were 5, but there are 5 existing QHINs, Qualified Health Information Networks, all of which talk to one another. And then they themselves have both participants and sub-participants. And that sounds like a really high-level concept. So let's actually peel that a bit further. Let's look at the next slide. And the next slide actually shows us the specifics as to how this model happens. Now, think of a world in which, in prior slide, a QHIN basically connects its participants. Now, its participants could be a provider, could be a health information exchange, a health systems, a pharmacy, and or IT health system, even a consumer app. Every single one of those has the ability to have sub-participants. Maybe the health information exchange has a consumer app, has providers or EHR end users. All of these systems and ecosystems are ultimately connected to one another. Why? For the simple purpose of interoperability, to exchange data. Now, since I mentioned interoperability, and it's TEFCA and interoperability are going to be 2 themes that are going to be keep reappearing, going to be fairly thematic. I want to talk about that. Stage 1 is, and I would be remiss if I mentioned that these are my own 4 stages of interoperability. So they're defined. I think most of us will largely agree, but this is how I think of it in my head. The reality is stage 1 of interoperability is access to data. I think that we can all agree that while there may be work to do yet, the reality is that it's largely been addressed. Today, we have easy access, or we have some broad access to data. Second point is the use and consumption of that data, right? How do we take that standard and use it? Well, that's also been addressed largely by the work of people like HL7 and Care Quality and Commonwealth and some of the QHINs and some of the data aggregators. The reality is that's been solved, whether we transmit in HL7 and CCDA and FHIR. The industry has largely addressed that. So we went from having, remember, no access to data to suddenly having a lot of data to now we have access to data, and we more or less have figured out how to use it. And we're now entering what I would call the 3rd stage of interoperability, which is a mouthful, obviously, which is both insights and actions. And what I mean by that is we can call it the beginning, the middle of the beginning of the end. But the reality is this is primarily where the most of the industry is focusing its efforts on. And we'll talk about this in greater detail in upcoming slides. But it is exactly in this section where it is now up to us as a collective organizations to basically take all that data, all of those data points, and mesh them into something that is both meaningful and actionable. What does that mean? That means transacting and translating data into intelligence into some action that an organization can take for the benefit of the patient, for the benefit of the organization themselves, and ultimately for the benefit of patient engagement and the overall collective. And then obviously point 4, and I would be remiss, is the full cycle of care. What does that mean? Well, in layman's term, what that means is if we pull data, we consume it and we process it, and then ultimately we make some insights. Those insights are likely to have actions and outcomes. Those outcomes should ultimately be routed to the system of record, whatever that system may be. Maybe it's an EMR, maybe it's an RCM. It's just whatever the native system that the organization or set organization is using to serve as its North Star. Now, why do I say all of that? Because let's talk about what's on the horizon, right? When I think about this is how do we use data and why do we use data? Now, in the prior slide, I mentioned the stages of interoperability. Well, let's talk about this, and more than a fancy dashboard, which looks pretty cool from the Salient folks. The reality is that now that we have access to this data, and now that we have the ability to consume it, we all need a tool, whatever that tool is, that provides somewhat of a seamless experience for accessing and analyzing data. Should be something that offers us both, I'll speak for personal preference, a user-friendly interface, which can be customizable and movable, because while I'm not a data scientist, I do enjoy consuming data, and I do enjoy slicing data backwards and forwards, and I want to understand what happens if I have the ability to modify my key entry data points. But all of this should be done, I hope, at least, again, speaking for preference, without the need for a complex query writing mechanism, allowing me as a user to uncover insights. Because at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, what we as a collective should be looking for is we should use this data, turn into intelligence, turn into action to do a few things. Number one is to understand the cost intelligence. Number two is to understand what's driving the ins and outs of healthcare, to find opportunities and document risks, and to quantify and implement value. And what that means is just really the unlocking of the power of healthcare data, because all of these tools could ultimately and should ultimately be used for the transition of care. How often do we think about transitions of care, sending and receiving notifications where patients are admitted, it's like ADTs, et cetera, or prior authorizations, right? Or risk adjustment, patient access, gaps in care. All of these things are ultimately what drives everything that we do and should be tied to data that turns into intelligence, that turns into an action, so that we not only can unlock the data translated into power within healthcare, but as I said before, also and fundamentally answer these questions. Use cost intelligence to highlight patterns of care, discover what's driving the ins and outs of a population, find missed opportunities to document patient risk, quantify a value for implementing a best practice in care management, and ultimately measuring and outcomes, right? So when I think about all of this, the terms is, what should a data strategy look like? Well, that intelligence should be accessible and actionable. That goes without saying. That sounds like a slogan. No pun to the marketing folks. But when I think about this, I think about a few things. Number one, I think about a panel that I was on with Paul Wilder, who is the executive director of Commonwealth, which is actually one of the QHINs. And somebody asked a similar question. So what do I do next? Join Care Quality, join Commonwealth, join QHIN, sign up with the data aggregator. Begin by beginning, because the infrastructure is there. But the real question is, what should my strategy look like? Well, a few data points to begin. First and foremost, we are operating within a $4.3 trillion industry, which ultimately represents about 18% of our GDP. Two, there has been a post-pandemic disintermediation and commoditization and access to data. So data is more or less free-flowing, and I'm going to use the free-flowing term with caution, right? Because not everyone can just access data, but it is broadly accessible. And also vertical integration has nearly been done, meaning there's no more MDs to acquire. Most of these massive health systems are vertically integrated into themselves. So the takeaway really should be participate in data exchange and insights. To me, insights are going to be the key. Obviously, I would be remiss if I don't mention the buzzwords of the moment, which is insights powered by ultimately machine learning and AI will obviously be transformational in this part of the industry. And I want to be very careful how I say the next thing because I want to ensure that my statement isn't it's not a bad soundbite, but I let's talk about the elephant in the room. We are in healthcare, and healthcare is a trillion-dollar business. So we are running a business. We want to do the very best with the tools that we have to provide the very best for our patients. Having said that, the organization that ultimately learns how to weaponize data the best will ultimately have a real shot at quote unquote winning. What do I mean by learning how to weaponize data? Well, it's the organization that ultimately takes raw data, makes that data intelligence, makes that intelligence actionable, and makes it accessible to its patients, its doctors, its ecosystems, right? A few points to note. The National Library of Medicine estimates that there's roughly about anywhere from 760 to $935 billion in savings to be addressed from wasteful events. So 30%, roughly 30% of all of the healthcare spent could be more effective. I mean, hate to sound like a venture capital, but we are working within an industry that if we are as successful as we aim to be in reducing waste, our TAM, our total available market, will actually and should actually shrink. So what are the best things and the best tools that we can do? I would leave you with number one, support TEFCA and QHINs. And whether that means signing up with some of these data aggregators, joining a QHIN. And remember, I say support, and let me specify that. Support means be an active participant, because let's remember that participation in some of these endeavors is not mandatory. While there is a great opportunity that organizations like CMS, like the CDC, are actively looking at this because ultimately they are, federally appointed and federally endorsed programs, they will look at this and the efficacy and determine a best route forward. But it behooves us, those people that are daily in daily operations in the healthcare ecosystem, to take full advantage of the tools that are available to us today. So when I say support TEFCA, support QHINs, join a QHIN, join an aggregator, I mean, do it today, because the reality is that it is an election year. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But like any program, at some point, the effectiveness, the adoption of TEFCA and interoperability are going to be measured. And it would be a shame to have such a robust program cease to exist just because of lack of use. So we can't complain about no access to data, right? And the other thing that I would say is you have to have a data insights strategy. You have to have a data insight solutions. And one of the things that this is something I stole from someone I admire very, very much. Whatever you pick, whatever solution, ensure that it is backwards and forwards compatible. And what that means is, obviously, there is a ton of solutions out there. Obviously, there's a ton of systems out there. So be mindful to pick something that is open enough to work with whatever existing solutions are, and basically can seamlessly integrate into anything and everything that you want to use and participate within your native solutions. Well, what is the future of TEFCA? What is the future of interoperability? That's a good question. It's actually more or less a representation of both of these slides, right? On the one hand, the enough work has been done for the road to be a straight shot into the sunset. We have an established framework, we have governance, we have participations, we have an infrastructure, but also there is potential for it being windy and treacherous and mountainous and unclear, because participation is not mandatory, because there are some overarching trust issues in making sure that everyone who's accessing data is accessing it for the right thing. So it really takes all of us to be involved, to be an active participant, because the future of TEFCA and interoperability is largely going to be dictated by your engagement. Well, I sincerely hope that you have at least been entertained in some thoughts. I believe, I hope I have piqued some levels of curiosity with this presentation.
Thank you so much, Sergio. We will actually not do the Q&A since we're recording. However, we will remind you to please visit our VBC exhibit hall, our virtual booth that is available on vbcexhibithall.com. You can go ahead and view Salient Healthcare there. Or alternatively, you can reach out to Sergio using this information, his email address, at any time, and ask any questions that you may have regarding today's presentation. Sergio, do you have anything else to add?
No, I thank you for your attendance. I thank you for your participation and engagement, and I look forward to hearing from you. And if nothing else, at least, and I hope that at a minimum, it was a half an hour worthwhile.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your time.